So this is the third block of learning at the Lighthouse Project in Middleton as part of the MidiDigi series. This is our investigation into open source, what we refer to as a democratic meritocracy. There's an old saying that they hang the man who steals the goose from the common, but they knight the man who steals the common from the goose. So we're going to explore the historical context of the Commons and the Enclosure Act and how that pertains to today's digital commons. So the commons, pre-enclosure, in medieval England people had common land. It was shared pastures, forests and fields where peasants could graze livestock, gather firewood and farm. It was managed collectively through customary rights and not privately owned. The Enclosures Acts came in the 16th century and ran to the late 19th century and still in existence now. This were wealthy landowners, and Parliament, consider that Parliament was made up of wealthy landowners, privatised common lands via fencing and enclosure, known as the Enclosure Act. It was justified, as often things are, as being efficient, but dispossessed rural communities, forcing people into wage labour in the newly expanding industrial towns. So the result of this was a concentration of wealth for said landed gentry and a loss of communal self-sufficiency. Open source software and open practices are often referred to as the digital commons. So this includes things like Linux operating systems, Wikipedia, Creative Commons. They function as a digital common. It's a shared resource and it's maintained collectively. Examples are like GitHub, where there's communal code pastures, Wikipedia, where it's a shared knowledge field and people can contribute, etc, etc. And, we've got public data sets, so there is hell of a lot of open source data out there that people can draw on. AI models are grazing it like crazy. So the 21st century version of enclosures is corporate capture of those digital commons. So tech giants are benefiting massively from open source. Companies like Google, who open sourced Android to get ahead of the game in phone market, Kubernetes in terms of hosting, things like this. But they often do this without the reciprocity that's expected in this kind of open practice. So we've also got things like patents and DRM, restrictive intellectual property laws, locking down code and data, and AI models, the weights that they use for modelling, even though it's using open data, that's often proprietary, so you can't see how they're actually doing it, as well as platform feudalism, so people actually buying it, putting fences around things like GitHub, because it's now owned by Microsoft. That common now does have a fence around it by Microsoft. I mean, it's still quite open in how it's used. However, Microsoft does have the power to change those rules. The parallel struggles of what we've got here, so like the aspect is they're like the resource, the privatisation force, the resistance and the outcome. So in our land enclosure, we had the common lands, and now in our digital enclosure, we've got open source code, we've got the data knowledge, all this open data. The privatisation force was the Enclosure Acts, and in the digital enclosure privatisation force, we've got patents, proprietary licenses, corporate control. The resistance, we had the peasants' revolt, like Wat Tyler and the diggers and people like that, and or the pedants' revolt, where we can say Witch Tyler. We like that joke. And in our digital resistance, we've got the free software movement, we've got the GPL copyright, we've got decentralisation, we've got Fediverse, we've got a lot of people fighting the corner. Mozilla, the Mozilla Foundation at the moment are very, very busy fighting to protect these commons from such massive corporate interests. So the key questions of this are the power dynamics. Who controls the fences in digital spaces? GitHub, app stores. You can't just put your app on Android and have it approved in the Play Store, for instance. I mean, we saw all the trouble with Huawei and Android that you could no longer download. They just will not put the Google Play Store on Huawei phones, which is just like geopolitical stuff. So if it's open source, why can't you? Well, you can do, you can work round, you can turn security features off, etc, etc. But it's clearly a fence been put round an open source project. And, the meritocracy myth, does open source truly resist enclosure, or do corporations still dominate? So if a big corporation's got loads of developers that they're on their payroll and they create projects, and they just make it incredibly difficult. So they do put a lot of fences around to stop you using that code yourself, or, having input into that code, or just seeing what's going on. So the solutions is like, how do we protect the digital commons? I mentioned before, like GPL licensing, decentralized platforms like Codeberg, and also there's another funding one, like mutual aid in open source funding. If you've done well financially from an open source project, surely there should be mutual aid to fund a lot of these open source projects. And why it matters to me, because it does amplify a democratic meritocracy. It shows that open source is part of a centuries-old struggle. Who controls the shared resources? These are shared resources. We control them. And it also gives us a critical lens as students, learners, that open doesn't always equal good. We'll see the word open on a lot of things. The corporates like OpenAI, for instance, isn't open. They use the word open because people think it's open source and it's a marketing trick and things like that. It's action orientated. It inspires advocacy for digital commoning. So you can contribute to decentralized alternatives, like Mastodon, like PeerTube, and like projects on GitHub and things like that. You can contribute. This is what's so good about it, that you can actually take part in creating something that yourself. So we're going to go back and we're going to see from the why to the how. So obviously, pretty much argue that most of this started with Richard Stallman, who hacked the Unix operating system and created GNU, GNU's not Unix. So it was a free Unix-like operating system. So, it was a little bit geeky, had to get into not much of a user interface, but, if he was like a computer science nerd, it was quite good. But along came Linus Torvald, and in 1991 he created the Linux kernel. So in other words, he created an actual complete operating system that normal people can use and interact with, send email, browse the web, the usual stuff that people do on computers, as well as everything else, create a great common full of resources. Linux and open source is dominating the world at the moment. Android phones, which are Linux based, they dominate the mobile market. Nearly all web servers and cloud servers and things like that, practically all Linux. And also, Linux for everyone. So the continuing growth of gaming, like the Steam engine, the Steam gaming engine, and you can even install a Steam operating system and create your own little games console and things like that. You can even have developer tools, so you can sort of mimic Linux on Windows, the WSL, and desktop polish. So things are a lot better now. The desktops for me in Linux operating systems are absolutely remarkable, and definitely in comparison to ones that you can't necessarily change in things like Windows. I'm a big fan of KDE Plasma, but if you don't like how a particular desktop environment is, you can just change it, and that I absolutely find fantastic. So Linus Torvald once described Richard Stallman as, so he's the god of free software, but he was the engineer. So he took this remarkable thing that Richard Stallman did and actually turned it into something that people could use. And it absolutely, obviously this slide isn't big enough to show all the different streams that have come off the various sort of cores of Linux, like Debian and Red Hat and Arch. It's just a massive set of operating systems that have come off that. And somebody asked me in the session actually about, how do you decide what operating system's for you? And it is just a case of trial and error, or do research which one's best for you. I mean, I used Ubuntu for donkey's years, and then, I discovered Ubuntu Studio, which suits what I do. The one I find the best for most people with the best UX is Pop! OS, made by System76. Absolutely fantastic usability. But anyway, what we're going to do now is we're going to install operating systems on the computers that we've got. So first of all, we're going to discuss what an ISO image is. An ISO image is it's like a digital box, so like a CD. So everything is contained on that CD that you need. All the files and the folders and the structure is all contained on that. So we can copy that ISO image. It doesn't have to be on a CD. It can be on, a thumb drive, a USB stick. So we need to copy or burn an ISO image to bootable media. So we need to go online, find what version of Linux we want, and then we need to copy that. They would refer to it as burning, but there's no fire taking place. But it's from the old days of laser where you copy it to a disk. But it means you're just writing all the components, all the contents of that ISO image onto a USB drive. And that USB drive becomes a boot disk then. You can't put anything else on it, it's just literally that. ISO image burners, so when you download it you need something to burn that image to a disk. There's Rufus on Windows. The one that I really like, I like Balena Etcher. There's loads of really good tools from Balena as well. If you do like, amateur electronics, a lot of Raspberry Pi projects on there. Startup Disk Creator comes out of the box with Ubuntu. And I also like using the Raspberry Pi Imager, because you can download the Raspberry Pi Imager, not just for doing images for Raspberry Pis. You can actually do it for your, any USB drive for any operating system. So to boot from USB, we plug our USB stick into our computer, turn our computer on. We have an interrupt key that we press, F12, escape, F10. Delete, the different in each device. Then it will come up with a boot menu on the screen, and it gives us an option to boot from whatever drive, and one of them there will be the USB drive. So we boot from the USB drive. I know it's a little bit small and difficult to see, but what we're going to do is we're going to, if you don't mind this week, if you want to have a bit of an examine of alternatives 2. So you've got Alternatives 2 website, you've got OSS, which is open source software alternatives 2.2, and you've got the GitHub associations lists, I think they're called. But yeah, so I mean, you can look at them and just have a look at what software that you use and think, can I use an open source alternative? And next week we're going to be looking at open source applications and all the opportunities that come along with that. There's a myriad of applications out there. So we said before, if you look at Alternatives 2, you can see all the applications out there. Pretty much all Linux distributions come with a software store, so you can actually see all the various software and how much it's installed and what ratings it's had and things like that as well. It's really, really good. But also, if you master any of these tools, you've got things like Blender, things like Open Broadcast Studio. All these things, if you master them, these are really rare and valuable skills that could generate you income one day.